My father left the farm where I worked half my life to my brother, and only gave me an old barn, but what I found inside was worth more than 100 farms like. I was standing under cold rain in front of Crawford Legal Office sign, staring at the brass nameplate like it held all the answers to my future. Name's Abe Logan. I'm 41, an auto mechanic with hands that have seen more grease than a McDonald's fryer. Water was dripping off my old John Deere baseball cap, but I couldn't make myself move. My whole life, I figured the farm where I'd been driving tractors with Dad and Grandpa, since I was knee-high to a grasshopper, would be mine someday. But I was about to find out just how wrong a man can be about his own future. You know that feeling when you're walking into something that's going to change everything, and your gut is telling you it ain't going to be good news? That's exactly where I was standing that Tuesday morning in November. The lawyer, Mr. Crawford himself, had called me the day before. His voice sounded like he was about to deliver news that would knock me sideways. He'd said Dad's was ready to be read, and both Tom and I needed to be there at 10 sharp. Let me paint you a picture of how I grew up. Every morning before school, I was out there mending fences, hauling hay bales that weighed more than I did, listening to Grandpa smoke his pipe on the porch while he told stories about the old days. The old man had this way of looking at life that stuck with me like pine sap on your fingers. He'd blow smoke rings and tell me that the dust on my boots was my story, and I shouldn't let anyone wipe it clean. That farm was in my blood, deeper than motor oil under my fingernails. But life has a funny way of taking you down roads you never planned to travel. After I married Laura, I had to take that job at Henderson's auto shop because the farm wasn't bringing in enough money to keep the lights on. I always figured it would be temporary, you know? Like borrowing your neighbor's lawnmower. You plan to give it back real soon. The farm would still be there waiting for me. Tom had hightailed it to the city when he turned 18, leaving nothing behind but a cloud of fancy cologne and empty promises about coming back to help out during harvest season. Now here I am, squeezed into a cramped rental apartment in Crawford with my 17-year-old daughter Casey. After Henderson laid me off last month, we're counting every penny like it's gold. Casey's got this way of making light of our situation that both breaks my heart and keeps me going at the same time. She looked out our window at the neighbor's garbage bins the other day and joked that our inheritance was probably going to be the local mutt who barks at pigeons every morning at 6 a.m. She even suggested we name him Logan, like it was some kind of family tradition we should be proud of. That kid's got more wisdom in her pinky finger than most grown folks have in their entire noggin. While I'm sitting there worrying about the future, like a country song waiting to happen, she's already figuring out how to make the best of whatever hand we've been dealt. It's moments like these that remind me why I keep getting up every morning. Even when everything feels like it's going sideways faster than a shopping cart with a busted wheel. Laura packed up and headed for her sister's place in Omaha 2 months ago. Her parting words still sting like accidentally grabbing a hot exhaust pipe. She said she was tired of waiting for me to become somebody worth sticking around for. I guess 23 years of marriage wasn't enough time for her to figure out who I really was underneath all the flannel shirts and work boots. But Casey, she's my North Star in this whole mess. That girl sees something in me that I'm not even sure exists anymore. Makes me think maybe I'm not as washed up as I feel most days. Walking into Crawford's office that morning felt like showing up to my own wake. The secretary, Marge, was pecking away at her computer when I accidentally knocked over her coffee mug, trying to hang up my jacket. Coffee went everywhere, soaking into some important-looking papers, and her sweater that probably came from the Walmart clearance rack. She jumped up and hollered that whatever inheritance I was about to get had already cost her a perfectly good outfit. I apologized about 50 times while helping her mop up the mess with those tiny napkins that don't absorb anything, but she was chuckling by then. Small-town folks are good that way. They don't stay mad longer than it takes to clean up spilled coffee. Tom was already sitting in the waiting area when I walked in, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else on earth. He was wearing one of those fancy suits that probably cost more than I make in a month, checking his phone every 30 seconds like he was expecting a call from the president. Mr. Crawford finally called us both into his office, and we sat down in those leather chairs like we were about to negotiate a peace treaty. He opened Dad's will, and started reading in his fancy lawyer voice, all formal and stuffy like he was announcing the winner of some contest neither of us remembered entering. The words seemed to bounce off the walls without making much sense at first. Then reality smacked me upside the head like a 2x4 with nails in it. Dad had left the main farmhouse, the good fields that actually grew things, the barn, and all the equipment that was worth more than my truck to Tom. His reasoning, according to the will, was that Tom had gotten his fancy business degree and would know how to manage the property like some kind of agricultural CEO. What I got was essentially the back 40 that even the cows avoided, 10 acres of sandy soil that wouldn't grow weeds if you watered them with liquid gold. The old shed came with my portion of the inheritance, along with Grandpa's 1960s tractor that hadn't run since gas was under $1 a gallon. I remember thinking that at least I got something with heart and history, even if it wasn't worth much in dollars and cents. Tom, who had been sipping his $6 latte like he's some kind of coffee expert from Seattle, finally spoke up. His exact words hit me like finding out your favorite fishing spot got turned into a strip mall. According to him, I was better suited for wrenches and oil changes in corn and cattle anyway. He suggested I take my barn and quit my belly aching about it. Said it with this smirk like he was doing me some kind of favor. After we left the lawyer's office, I drove around Crawford for about an hour, just trying to wrap my brain around everything that had just happened. The rain had stopped, but the clouds were still hanging overhead like they couldn't decide whether to move along or stick around to see what happened next. I ended up parking outside the Dairy Queen, where Casey works part-time, scooping ice cream and taking orders from folks who still remember when she was in diapers. Through the window, I could see her making someone's blizzard, her ponytail bouncing as she flipped the cup upside down to prove it wouldn't spill. That's when it hit me like a lightning bolt that no matter what Dad's was said, I still had the most important thing in my whole world. Casey was counting on me to figure this mess out, and I'd be darned if I was going to let her down. By the time evening rolled around, word had already spread through town faster than gossip at a church potluck. Downtown at the Old Oak Bar, the whole town was buzzing about the will like bees around a honey pot. Small towns are like that. Everybody knows your business before you do, and they're not shy about sharing their opinions. Old Fred was pointing his finger at me over his Budweiser, telling me I should sell that sandy patch and buy myself a pickup truck that doesn't sound like it's coughing up a lung every time I start it. I was smiling and nodding like a bobblehead, but inside I felt like a demolition derby was happening in my chest. Grandpa used to say that a real man holds onto his land, even when it looks like nothing but dirt and broken dreams. Those words were rattling around in my head like loose change in a coffee can. That evening, Casey was sprawled on our second-hand couch that we got from a garage sale, scrolling through her phone like all kids do these days. She looked up at me with those bright eyes that remind me so much of Laura back when we first started dating. She suggested we drive out to the farm and take a peek at my shed. Maybe there was buried treasure or something cool hidden inside, she said with that smile that could power half the county. The way she said it, like we were about to go on some kind of adventure instead of just looking at my consolation prize, made me remember why being her dad was the best job I'd ever had. We climbed into my old pickup truck, which makes more noise than a tractor pull competition, and headed out to the family farm that now had Tom's name on the deed. The drive took about 15 minutes on back roads that I could navigate with my eyes closed, giving us plenty of time to listen to Casey's wild theories about what we might find. She was convinced there had to be something valuable stashed away, something Dad had either forgotten about or hadn't bothered to mention in his will. Maybe Grandpa had hidden something important before he passed, she figured. The 10 acres sat at the edge of the main property, separated by a line of oak trees that Grandpa had planted back when Eisenhower was president. The shed stood there like an old soldier at attention, covered in weeds and ivy that had been growing wild for years. I pulled out my flashlight and walked up to the door, which was held shut by a rusty latch that put more fight than a catfish on a hook. When I finally wrestled it open, dust swirled around the beam of light, like tiny tornadoes having a square dance. Casey was poking around in the shadows when she called out in that curious voice she gets when she finds something interesting. She was crouched down in the corner, brushing dust and spider webs off what looked like an old wooden box. When she wiped away more of the grime with her sleeve, we could both see the numbers 1947 carved deep into the wood, like someone had taken their time to make sure those numbers would last forever. Casey was holding that box like it was a holy grail from an Indiana Jones movie. I pried it open, and the smell of old wood hit me like walking into my grandpa's workshop after he'd been gone for 20 years. Inside were yellowed papers that looked older than dirt, a black and white photograph of Grandpa standing next to the tractor, and a handwritten note that made my heart skip a beat. The note said exactly what I needed to hear right then, for the one who still believes in the land. My hands were shaking like I'd had too much coffee as I lifted out what looked like engineering blueprints. These weren't just any old drawings either. At the top of the first page, in Grandpa's careful handwriting, it said Engine Prototype 1947, and below that, in bigger letters, "This will change farming forever. Don't give up." I had to sit down on an old milk crate because my legs went wobbly. Casey was looking at me like I'd just seen a ghost, which honestly wasn't too far from the truth. Those words from Grandpa felt like he was standing right there in that dusty shed, talking to me across all those years. I remembered him sitting on the front porch every evening after supper, smoking his pipe and muttering about engines that could run on corn instead of gasoline. Back then, I thought he was just an old man with big dreams and too much time on his hands. But looking at these blueprints, I realized Grandpa hadn't been daydreaming at all. He'd been designing something that was decades ahead of its time. The drawing showed an engine designed to run on biofuel made from agricultural waste, complete with detailed notes about compression ratios and fuel injection systems adapted for plant-based fuels. Casey was poking around in the corner when she let out a whoop that probably scared every mouse in the county. She found an old cassette tape stuck behind a rusty toolbox, and the label said Johnny Cash Greatest Hits in faded marker. We found an ancient boom box that looked like it belonged in a museum, but when I hit the power button, darned if it didn't fire right up. The opening chords of Folsom Prison Blues filled that old shed, and for a moment it felt like Grandpa was right there with us. I told Casey that Grandpa would have said this was the perfect soundtrack for a rebellion against the oil companies. The man in black singing about being stuck in prison while we were looking at blueprints for freedom from fossil fuels. It felt like poetry and justice all rolled into one. With Johnny Cash providing the background music, I decided to see if that old tractor had any life left in it. I'd been working on engines since I was tall enough to hold a wrench, so I figured it was worth a shot. I checked the oil, which looked like chocolate syrup, and tried to turn the engine over by hand. Everything was seized up tighter than a pickle jar, but I've never been one to give up easy. I grabbed some penetrating oil from my truck and started working on the cylinder heads. About an hour later, I climbed up into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine coughed like an old man with pneumonia, belched out a cloud of black smoke that would make a diesel truck jealous, and the loud noise apparently scared every critter in the area. Just as the engine started to settle into a steady rhythm, a raccoon came tearing out of the tall weeds behind the shed like his tail was on fire. That little bandit was madder than a wet hen, and apparently didn't appreciate being woken up from his afternoon nap. He hit the ground running and disappeared into the woods faster than a politician changes his mind during election season. Casey was laughing so hard she nearly fell over. She said I'd scared that raccoon worse than she got scared when she saw her algebra grades last semester. That kid always knows how to find the humor in any situation, even when we're standing in a dusty shed trying to resurrect a machine older than both of us put together. The tractor actually stayed running after that dramatic introduction, puttering along like it was just taking a 20-year nap. The sound of that engine brought back a flood of memories from when I was a kid, riding alongside Dad during harvest season. Later that week, Casey and I loaded those blueprints into my truck and headed to the Crawford County Fair. It wasn't much a fair by big city standards, but it was our annual excuse to eat corn dogs, watch pig races, and catch up with folks we only saw once a year. That's where I ran into Sarah Henderson, though I hadn't seen her since we graduated from Crawford High back in '99. She'd been Sarah Mills back then, one of the smart kids who always had her nose in a book and actually understood what the teachers were talking about in physics class. Sarah had gotten married right after college and moved away to work as an engineer in some big tech company. But life is a funny way of bringing people back home when they need it most. She returned to Crawford about 6 months earlier, recently divorced, and looking to reconnect with something real after years of corporate life. When she saw me studying Grandpa's blueprints at a picnic table, she wandered over with the kind of curiosity that engineers get when they spot something interesting. Her first look at those drawings made her eyes light up like Christmas morning. She told me this wasn't just an engine design. It was my grandfather's dream wrapped up in paper and preserved for someone who would understand its value. The way she said it, with a smile that warmed me up like a shot of good whiskey after a long day, made me realize I hadn't felt this kind of connection with anyone since Laura and I were newlyweds. Sarah offered to help me understand the technical aspects of Grandpa's design. She had the engineering background I was missing, and I had the mechanical know-how she needed. It seemed like a perfect partnership, assuming I didn't mess it up somehow. Casey, who notices everything and keeps her opinions to herself about, as well as a leaky bucket holds water, whispered to me that Sarah seemed pretty cool. Then she added that I should probably try not to ruin my chances by wearing my rattiest flannel shirt if I was planning to see her again. That kid has more relationship advice than a daytime talk show host, and she's usually right about these things. It occurred to me that maybe Casey was seeing something in Sarah that I was trying not to get my hopes up about. The more Sarah and I talked about those blueprints, the more excited we both got. She explained that Grandpa's design was basically an engine that could run on biofuel made from farm waste, something that was decades ahead of its time. In 1947, nobody was thinking about alternative fuels or environmental impact. But Grandpa had been looking at the problem from a farmer's perspective. He saw all the corn stalks and other agricultural waste that got burned or thrown away every harvest, and he figured there had to be a way to turn that waste into something useful. Sarah pointed out details in the drawings that I would have missed. She showed me how Grandpa had designed a compression system that could handle biofuels made from different types of organic material, and how the fuel injection system was calibrated for the different properties of plant-based fuels. The genius of it was that it could run on biofuel made from stuff farmers were already producing: corn stalks, wheat chaff, even with chips from pruning trees. Instead of buying expensive diesel fuel, farmers could literally fuel their tractors with fuel made from their own waste products. As we sat there in my kitchen that evening, with those blueprints spread across my worn-out table and Sarah sketching improvements on her tablet, I started to feel something I hadn't felt in years. It was hope mixed with excitement, and maybe just a little bit of that feeling you get when you think your luck might finally be changing. Sarah was studying every detail of Grandpa's work with a kind of intensity that told me she understood exactly what we were looking at. Her pencil moved across her tablet like she was conducting an orchestra, and her eyes had that bright look people get when they're seeing possibilities instead of problems. She looked up at me and said something that gave me chills in the best possible way. She told me that my grandfather wasn't just a farmer. He was a visionary who had seen the future of agriculture 50 years before anyone else caught up. And according to her, we were going to make his dream come true. Sarah was sitting at my worn-out kitchen table, studying those blueprints with the intensity of a detective solving a murder case. Her eyes were bright with excitement as she looked up at me, and I could tell she was seeing possibilities that I was still trying to wrap my head around. She told me that my grandfather had been a true visionary, designing something that was decades ahead of its time. The way she explained it, we weren't just looking at old drawings. We were holding the key to giving farmers real independence from corporate fuel prices. For the first time in years, I felt something growing in my chest that felt an awful lot like hope. We weren't just talking about theories anymore. We were going to build this thing and prove that Grandpa's dream could work. Over the next few weeks, Sarah and I turned that old shed into something that looked like a cross between a garage and a science lab. The plan was to modify Grandpa's old tractor engine according to his blueprints rather than build something from scratch. We didn't have the equipment or budget for that kind of manufacturing. I was doing what I do best, rebuilding the fuel injection system, modifying compression ratios, and making stubborn metal parts work together in ways they weren't originally designed for. Sarah was handling the engineering calculations, figuring out exactly how to adapt a 1960s engine to run on modern biofuel. The biggest challenge was getting our hands on actual biofuel to test with. Sarah knew a guy from her engineering days who ran a small biodiesel operation about 50 miles away. He agreed to sell us a few gallons of corn-based ethanol blend, though he warned us that most older engines couldn't handle the stuff without serious modifications. Casey appointed herself as our official documenter, filming everything on her phone while making commentary that would put sports announcers to shame. She kept saying we were like Iron Man, except with a tractor instead of flying suit and a budget that wouldn't buy a decent used car. The kid had a point, though. We were trying to build something revolutionary in a shed that smelled like mouse droppings and old motor oil, using tools that were older than disco music. But somehow, it felt like we were exactly where we needed to be. One afternoon, while we were working on the fuel injection system, Sarah and I both reached for the same wrench at the same time. Our hands touched, and when we looked up, we bumped foreheads like a couple of teenagers who didn't know what they were doing. We both started laughing, and Sarah said something that made me blush harder than a sunburn in July. She told me I was better than any engine she'd ever worked on. I felt like I was 16 again, getting my first compliment from the prettiest girl in school. The romance wasn't the only thing heating up in that shed. The engine modifications were giving us more trouble than a toddler at bedtime. Every time we thought we had the fuel mixture right, something would go wrong, and the old tractor would belch out clouds of black smoke like a dragon with indigestion. Casey, who never missed an opportunity for a good joke, announced that I'd invented the world's first agricultural vaping device. Sarah added that if we could get to play music, we might have the first tractor that could sing Sweet Home Alabama. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning after about 6 weeks of trial and error. We'd finally gotten the fuel injection timing just right, and the modified engine started up smooth as butter. More importantly, it ran clean on the biofuel blend and sounded like it was purring instead of coughing up a lung. Casey had been posting videos of our progress on TikTok with the hashtag Tractor1947, mostly just for fun. None of us expected what happened next. Within 3 days, that video had over 2 million views and comments from farmers all over the country. People were begging us to save them from diesel prices that were eating up their profits. One old farmer from Iowa commented that if our tractor actually worked, he'd give us his prize cow, Bessie, as a thank you gift. Another guy said he'd drive his pickup truck all the way from Texas just to see it run. The attention was flattering, but it also brought some complications we hadn't expected. Apparently, word travels fast in the agricultural world, and soon we had more visitors to our little shed than the county fair gets on opening day. That's when things got really interesting. A representative from something called Green Future AgTech showed up at our door one morning, wearing a suit that probably cost more than my truck and carrying a briefcase that looked like it belonged in a spy movie. This guy, who introduced himself as Marcus something or other, had done his homework. He knew exactly what we were working on, how much it could be worth, and why every farmer in America would want one. He also had an offer that made my head spin. Green Future wanted to buy Grandpa's blueprints for $1.5 million. Cash. No questions asked, money in the bank within a week. For a guy who'd been counting pennies just to pay rent, that kind of money seemed like winning the lottery and finding a $20 bill in your old jacket pocket all at the same time. But something about the whole situation didn't sit right with me. Sarah pulled me aside and whispered that companies like Green Future don't just buy ideas. They buy them to control them. She warned me not to trust them completely, no matter how good their offer sounded. I thought about what Grandpa would have wanted. He didn't design this engine to make some corporation rich. He designed it to help farmers like himself. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that selling out completely would betray everything he'd worked for. So I made what might have been the smartest or dumbest decision of my life. I told Marcus that I wasn't interested in selling the blueprints outright, but I might consider a partnership where we kept control of how the technology was used and who had access to it. Marcus didn't look particularly happy about my counteroffer, but he didn't pack up his briefcase and leave either. He said his company would need to think about it and get back to us. The way he said it made me think we were in for some interesting negotiations. Sarah was proud of me for not jumping at the first big offer, but she also reminded me that we were playing in the big leagues now. Companies like Green Future had lawyers, lobbyists, and resources we couldn't even imagine. We'd need to be smart about how we handled this. Casey, meanwhile, was having the time of her life being internet famous. Her TikTok followers had grown from about 50 to over 100,000 practically overnight. She was getting interview requests from agricultural magazines, and even a call from someone who claimed to work for the Discovery Channel. The whole situation was surreal. 3 months earlier, I'd been an unemployed mechanic whose biggest worry was making rent. Now I was sitting on technology that could revolutionize farming, with my high school crush helping me engineer it and my daughter becoming a social media star. But in quiet moments, when excitement died down, and it was just me in that shed with Grandpa's tools and his dreams, I kept hearing his voice. He used to say that the real treasure wasn't what you found. It was what you built with your own 2 hands. I was starting to understand what he meant. This engine wasn't valuable because of how much money it might make. It was valuable because it represented independence, sustainability, and the kind of innovation that comes from necessity rather than greed. The more farmers who contacted us, the more I realized we were sitting on something bigger than just a clever engineering solution. We had the potential to give small farmers a fighting chance against corporate agriculture and rising fuel costs. One evening, as Sarah and I were cleaning up the shed after another long day of testing and tweaking, she said something that really stuck with me. She told me that freedom isn't just about doing whatever you want. It's about not having to pay someone else for things you can provide for yourself. That philosophy seemed to capture everything Grandpa had been trying to achieve with his engine design. He'd seen farmers struggling with costs they couldn't control, and he'd tried to give them a way to take back some of that control. As we locked up the shed that night, I looked at the old tractor sitting there like a monument to stubborn determination and crazy dreams. Tomorrow, Marcus would be back with Green Future's response to our partnership proposal. Whatever they decided, I knew we'd cross a line we couldn't uncross. We'd proven that Grandpa's vision could work, and word was spreading faster than gossip at a church social. There would be no going back to the simple life now. Marcus showed up right on schedule the next morning, looking like he'd spent the night preparing for battle. He sat down at our makeshift conference table, really just a piece of plywood balanced on sawhorses, and spread out a contract that was thicker than a phone book. He adjusted his tie and launched into a speech about how Green Future wanted to partner with us to bring this revolutionary technology to farmers everywhere. It all sounded great on the surface, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there were hooks hidden in all that fancy language. As I looked at that contract, with its legal terminology and corporate letterhead, I kept thinking about something Grandpa used to say. He believed that the real treasure was always the thing you built yourself, not the thing someone else built for you. I signed that contract with Green Future, and while part of me wondered if I was making a deal with the devil, the advance money they provided changed everything. Suddenly, we had a real budget for proper tools, quality parts, and enough biofuel to run extensive tests without worrying about every gallon we burned. Grandpa used to say that the real treasure was always the thing you built yourself, but he also understood that sometimes you need the right resources to turn dreams into reality. The partnership with Green Future gave us exactly what we needed to take his 70-year-old design and make it work in the modern world. 5 months later, when Sarah and I finally perfected that engine and fired up for what felt like the 1,000th time, something magical happened. Instead of the usual coughing and sputtering, it didn't just rumble to life. It sang like good old rock and roll at a Nashville music festival. Every bolt, every wire, every carefully calibrated fuel injection setting had come together in perfect harmony. The sound of that engine running smooth on corn-based biofuel was better than any song I'd ever heard. We'd taken Grandpa's 70-year-old dream and turned it into something that could actually change how farmers across America powered their equipment. The numbers were even better than we'd hoped. Our modified engine ran on biofuel that cost about 40% less than diesel, and the fuel could be made from agricultural waste that farmers were already producing. Instead of sending their money to oil companies, they could literally fuel their tractors with their own corn stalks and wheat chaff. When we demonstrated the working engine at the Crawford County Fair that summer, the response was something I'll never forget. Farmers who'd been struggling with fuel costs that were eating up their profits gathered around that old tractor like it was performing miracles right before their eyes. Old Joe Martinez, who'd been farming in Crawford County since before I was born, started clapping and shouting that we'd save them all from the oil sharks who'd been bleeding farmers dry for decades. His wife was right there beside him, holding up a handmade sign that said, "Logan, our hero," in big red letters. The whole scene felt surreal. Less than a year earlier, I'd been an unemployed mechanic whose biggest claim to fame was fixing pickup trucks that barely ran. Now I had farmers treating me like I'd just discovered electricity or invented sliced bread. Casey, meanwhile, had turned into some kind of teenage media mogul practically overnight. She'd built a website with a forum where farmers could discuss biofuel conversion, share tips, and follow our progress. The kid was handling inquiries, social media, and building a network of interested farmers like she'd been running publicity campaigns her whole life. Her TikTok videos documenting our testing process were bringing in thousands of inquiries from farmers all over the Midwest, and we even got a call from CNN wanting to do a feature story. We weren't ready for mass production yet, but Casey was building the kind of community and interest that would be invaluable once we were. She kept joking that she was now the CEO while I was just a guy with a wrench, but honestly, I was proud as heck of how she'd stepped up. That kid had more business sense in her teenage brain than most adults I knew. The success was intoxicating, but it also brought pressures I hadn't expected. Suddenly, everyone wanted a piece of what we'd built. Agricultural equipment manufacturers were calling. Investment firms were sending representatives, and patent lawyers were explaining why we needed to protect our intellectual property. Through it all, Sarah kept me grounded. She reminded me that we weren't just building engines. We were giving small farmers a fighting chance against corporate agriculture and volatile fuel markets. Every conversation with an interested farmer represented independence for families who were tired of getting squeezed by forces beyond their control. Our partnership with Green Future was working better than I dared to hope. They handled the legal stuff and provided funding while we maintained control over pricing and who could access the technology. Most importantly, we made sure that small family farms would get priority over large corporate operations when we started production. On a warm September evening, as Sarah and I were cleaning up the workshop after another successful day of testing, I realized I had something important to ask her. We'd been working together for months, and somewhere between rebuilding fuel injectors and calculating compression ratios, I'd fallen completely head over heels in love with her. I picked up that same wrench we both reached for on our first day working together and got down on one knee right there in the shed where it all started. I told her that she brought more than just my grandfather's engine back to life. She brought me back to life, too. Sarah looked at me like I'd lost my mind and started laughing. She said it was probably the worst marriage proposal in the history of romance, delivered in a shed that smelled like motor oil and corn ethanol. But her answer was yes anyway. Sometimes the best moments in life happen in the most unlikely places. Just when everything seemed to be going perfectly, life threw us a curveball that reminded me why I'd never trusted good luck to last very long. Tom showed up at our workshop one morning with a lawyer who looked like he'd stepped out of a television commercial for personal injury lawsuits. My brother had apparently convinced himself that since the farm was his, anything related to Grandpa's work, including the blueprints and our modified engine, belonged to him too. The lawyer started throwing around legal terms like intellectual property and rightful ownership, while Tom stood there with his arms crossed like he was finally getting his revenge. The whole situation would have been funny if it hadn't been so aggravating. Tom hadn't shown the slightest interest in farming or anything related to it for over 20 years, but now that there was money involved, suddenly he was passionate about preserving our family's agricultural heritage. Fortunately, Dads will have been very specific about what belonged to whom. The shed, the old tractor, and anything found inside them were clearly designated as my inheritance. The blueprints had been stored in my shed on my land, and all the modifications we'd made were entirely our own work. When we ended up in front of Judge Harrison to settle the dispute, the whole thing felt like a bad episode of a daytime court show. Tom's lawyer presented a case that was thinner than tissue paper, while our attorney calmly pointed out the obvious facts about property rights and inheritance law. The judge dismissed Tom's claim faster than a line drive to first base, but I could see the frustration and anger in my brother's eyes as we left the courthouse. Part of me felt sorry for him. He'd spent so many years running away from this place that he'd missed his chance to be part of something meaningful. After the legal drama settled down, I decided to do something that I hoped would honor Grandpa's memory while ensuring that his story wouldn't be forgotten. I started converting part of the old shed into a small museum dedicated to agriculture innovation and the farmers who'd built this community. The centerpiece would be our first successfully modified engine, displayed alongside Grandpa's original blueprints and his old pipe that still smelled like the tobacco he used to smoke on the front porch. I also planned to include photos documenting our entire journey, including one of myself covered in soot and grease after one of our early failed attempts. Casey designed a plaque for the museum that captured everything I felt about our journey. It simply said, "Dust is just the beginning." A reminder that sometimes the most valuable things are hidden in the places other people overlook or dismiss. As word spread about our success, Green Future approached us about expanding into full-scale production. The numbers they were talking about were staggering. Potentially thousands of engine conversions per year, distribution networks across the Midwest, and profits that would set us up for life. But they also wanted us to move our headquarters to Chicago, where they could provide better infrastructure and access to manufacturing facilities. The offer was tempting from a business standpoint, but something about it felt wrong to me. I told them that Crawford was our home, and this was where our dust had turned into something extraordinary. Moving to the big city might make business sense, but it would betray everything Grandpa had stood for. Real innovation comes from understanding the problems you're trying to solve, and you can't understand farming from a downtown office building. By the time winter rolled around, we were finalizing plans for mass production that would stay right here in Crawford County. Green Future had agreed to build a manufacturing facility just outside town, creating jobs for local folks and keeping the whole operation connected to its agricultural roots. The night before our museum's grand opening, I stood in the workshop with Sarah and Casey, looking at everything we'd accomplished. The modified tractor sat there humming quietly on biofuel, surrounded by the tools and blueprints that had made it all possible. Tomorrow would bring hundreds of visitors, farmers, investors, reporters, and folks who just wanted to see what all the fuss was about. Johnny Cash would be playing from that old boom box, an American flag would be flying over the shed, and Casey would be reading her plaque to anyone who'd listen. On the morning of the museum opening, Johnny Cash was indeed booming from that ancient cassette player, and the wind was making the American flag dance over our little shed. Casey stood by her plaque, reading the words, "Where everyone sees dust, we saw the future," to a crowd of farmers who understood exactly what she meant. I was holding Grandpa's photograph, feeling that familiar lump in my throat. This wasn't just about an engine anymore. This was about our entire life, our community, and the kind of stubborn determination that turns impossible dreams into reality. Hundreds of farmers, investors, and a CNN camera crew had gathered to celebrate what we'd built together. When Casey stepped up to give a speech, she said something that nearly brought me to tears. She told everyone that her great-grandfather had believed in calluses over college degrees, and that this engine was for everyone who refused to give up on their dreams. The crowd of farmers erupted in applause, and I had to wipe my eyes with my flannel sleeve. That kid had captured everything that mattered about what we'd accomplished. That's when I spotted a familiar figure standing by the museum gates, wearing a blue dress I remembered buying for our 5th wedding anniversary. Laura had come back, looking like she was trying to decide whether to stay or run. She walked up to me while Sarah was explaining the technical details to a group of reporters. Laura said she'd made a mistake leaving, and she wanted to try to fix everything between us. For a moment, I felt that old familiar pull, the memory of 23 years together, and all the dreams we'd once shared. But then I looked at Sarah, who was holding my hand and talking passionately about sustainable agriculture, and I knew where my heart belonged now. I told Laura gently that my heart was with the people who'd stuck around to the hard times, not the ones who'd left when things got tough. Laura nodded like she'd expected that answer, gave me a sad smile, and walked back to her car. Some chapters of your life are meant to stay closed, no matter how much history you share. Later that afternoon, Tom showed up at the celebration, looking uncomfortable but determined. He walked over to me and admitted that I'd won fair and square. instead of rubbing it in. I handed him a beer and told him we weren't competitors. We were just brothers who'd chosen different paths in life. For the first time in years, Tom smiled at me like he actually meant it. Maybe we'd never be close again, but at least we didn't have to be enemies. As the sun was setting and the last visitors were heading home, I found myself sitting on a bench in front of the museum with Sarah and Casey on either side of me. In my hands was Grandpa's photograph, and I could almost hear his voice telling me that real inheritance isn't what you get, it's what you build. Casey looked at me and said something that perfectly captured how I was feeling. She told me that dust was just the beginning of possibilities, not the end of dreams. That kid was wise beyond her years. I looked at that photograph of Grandpa, with his weathered hands and eyes that still sparkled with curiosity, and I whispered that we hadn't given up. We'd taken his dust and turned it into hope for thousands of farming families across America. The museum was officially open. Our engine was heading into mass production, and I was surrounded by the people who mattered most. Grandpa would have been proud to see that his crazy dream about corn-powered tractors had finally become reality, 50 years after he'd sketched those first blueprints. As we sat there watching the last light fade over fields that had shaped 4 generations of Logans, I realized that some legacies aren't about land or money. They're about the courage to turn dust into dreams and dreams into something that changes the world.